Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. I'm so glad to be with you here today. However, you're watching either on YouTube or over a podcast. Today's going to be a kind of one-off episode. I'm just going to share kind of my thoughts on a particular thing. I titled this episode, "Why Third Way Missiology Isn't Enough." The alternative title I had in mind was "Why Third Wayism Needs to Die." And so we're going to have a good time talking about that on the podcast today. I kind of want to just walk you through a brief outline. I typed up third ways, and we're going to talk about what the third way approach is and what it isn't, kind of why it came about, where it came from. Try to highlight some good that it seeks to provide to the world. I think there's some redeemable aspects to it, but really we're going to spend most of our time on more of a critique of the approach itself and showing why I believe it to be insufficient. And then, I thought about saving this for the end, but one of the reasons it bothers me so much, this approach, just speaking from my personal experience, is really this is like the world I pursued in the academy was the world of epistemology, knowledge construction, missiology, and cultural engagement, and particularly through the works of James K. Smith and John Frame. I've studied this approach to cultural engagement. I've studied the postmodern kind of critique of modernism and the attempt to synthesize the modern black and white world. And I find it woefully insufficient and problematic in large ways. And so that's part of the reason it gets me riled up. So if you sense me a little bit more passionate on this, maybe less academic, that may be wise, is because I view it as really problematic. And I'll get to kind of those problems at the very end of the episode. But first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about third wayism or the third way approach to missiology? Well, the third way approach to missiology, there's a lot of different streams out there in terms of third way, but I really want to make sure we're clear on what I'm talking about here, because it's not just like a historic thing. It's something that came about fairly recently. In the last couple decades. And so it's a rhetorical strategy where a middle way is typically tried to be found between two opposed points of view. Whether those are truly opposing or not, we'll get to later, but it tries to find a middle way, a third way, between two opposite points of view. And so it's a rhetorical technique, it's a missiological technique to think through cultural engagement. And what you kind of get is two opposing parties, two opposing sides, and you try to navigate the middle. This is a classic, and I kind of rag on this because I do it myself sometimes. It's a classic sermon building technique. In sermon preparation, one of the tricks, and sorry, pastors, if I'm giving away your secret, one of the tricks you can use that can be useful just from a teaching standpoint is if you get stuck in a passage, let's say in Paul or in the Gospels, what you can do is you can highlight the principle, and then you can show a ditch on either side of the road. And they typically talk about this. Look, there's a ditch on this side, ditch on that side. We don't want to be in a ditch. We want to stay on the road. Here's the biblical principle to stay on the road. And so the classic one is legalism versus license. We create this kind of binary way of thinking that it's either legalism or license in our world. And then we create a new way, which is, liberty in the gospel or something like that. It's got to alliterate 3 L's. And so this is a classic sermon building technique that you can kind of fall back on if you get stuck in your illustrations or trying to understand some complicated passages. And it's not necessarily wrong, but it is a technique. It's a way to get across a point of view. And really what it seeks to do is it seeks to resolve tension and moral dilemmas. So we live in a really complicated world. Before the kind of modern age and industrial revolution, the internet, moral questions were less on the front of our minds in terms of like, what are we to do in any given situation? Our culture was more cohesive under Christendom. And so you had kind of a common understanding of how we were all going to reason morally together. And as the fragmentation continues to unfold and the erosion of any kind of semblance of a biblical worldview continues, what you see is people trying to adapt and trying to figure out how are we to navigate these complicated moral times and these complicated times in theology and cultural engagement. And so third wayism, the third way approach, seeks to find tension between moral dilemmas. So when did it come about? Well, I think it's kind of inevitable with the modern world. The modern world is made for binary thinking, black and white thinking. It's a world of lawyers and engineers. And what happened was that postmodernism arose out of modernism. So when I talk about modernism, I'm talking about kind of an Enlightenment attitude where it's this or that, a lot of proving things, a lot of right and wrong. It's exemplified in fundamentalism, where there's just a very black and white approach to humanity and to orthodoxy and theology. And so what really happened is in the 20th century, 21st century, the postmodern approach sought to critique the black and white perspective, saying that, well, maybe there's more relativism out there. Maybe things aren't as clear as modernism presupposes. And there's some truth to that. And if you wanted to read my book, Trinitarian Formation, you would see how I kind of touch on the subjectivity of truth and the contextualized nature of any truth. But what Third Wayism seeks to do is it really seeks to create kind of these new mixed orthodoxies based on a lot of times false dilemmas. And instead of doing that, my suggestion, of course, is to preach and teach the whole counsel of God, not create false dilemmas out of the counsel of God. I think it arose also because in evangelical subculture, we kind of have this flattening of sin. So we have this idea where because we want to love all people, and no matter what their sin is, no matter what they're struggling with, we flattened sin to where morally we don't have a good understanding of a graded sin kind of understanding that is more biblical. It's like we've taken a topographic map that shows mountains and valleys and all these sorts of things, and we've just gone, no, we're just going to flatten that all out. And there's some truth to that, right? All sin, no matter how morally repugnant or not, all sin ultimately is an offense to God, treason against God, the sovereign Lord of the universe. And so, yes, all sin is equal in its result being judgment before God and being separation from God. But that doesn't mean every sin is equal in terms of the magnitude of offense. This is an issue of hermeneutiology where we've so under-talked about sin and equipped people on the topic of sin that we've just made every sin the same. We've made every sin seem flat. So this is where you get an article like John Piper wrote before the last election where he was comparing the pride of Donald Trump to abortion. And he's saying both are bad, both are equally bad. And he was trying to make the argument that pride is actually, in some ways, more bad than abortion, more problematic, more sinful than abortion. Someone's pride is not the equivalent of murder. I don't understand that type of moral reasoning. I understand why he's trying to do it, but I don't understand that type of reasoning from a biblical perspective. A lot of Christians, they feel really trapped. They feel trapped in a world where, gosh, the world is looking at Christians and going, hey, like, you guys are a bunch of bigots and you hate people. And so Christians are going, well, that's not necessarily true. Like, I'm just trying to like follow God and love people. And so what they want to do is try to find another way to avoid taking sides, and they don't want to harm their public witness is kind of the phrase that goes along with third way approach. They don't want to harm their public witness, in other words, how they're perceived by people. And so they try to take a different approach than maybe some traditional approaches. Some thinkers who kind of brought this to the surface, who kind of rose this up within evangelicalism. The main guy in my estimation, mainly because that's who's been most influential for me, is a guy like Tim Keller. Tim Keller's notorious for this kind of thinking, where it's just he'll take two sides and he'll make them seem equally opposite, equally bad, and then he'll pitch a third way in between. This is why he was on the founding board of the AND campaign. And their slogan is compassion and conviction. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's a thinker who kind of has propagated this idea throughout evangelicalism. And then you've also got David French. David French is notorious for this as well. I think he probably took his cue from Keller. And we're going to talk about Keller's approach later. I've got a tweet thread I'm going to work through where he kind of talks about his approach and why he does it. And I'm going to offer some feedback on that. So what's good about this approach? Well, there are areas in the Bible where we see Jesus teach this way. I mean, Jesus can teach this way where it's look, neither of you are right. Neither the older son or younger prodigal son that ran away are right. It's God's grace that is right. So you can see Jesus teach this way by hitting on two parties at the same time. And so there is a way to employ this tactic, this rhetorical device, in a helpful manner. And so there are situations where this can be useful, like I mentioned, even in sermons where you're kind of creating two ditches on the side of the road. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think it's maybe a little sloppy and lazy sometimes, but it's not necessarily wrong. And so we see Jesus teach this way. Jesus endorses this. He doesn't use it as his only way of teaching, and he reserves some of his harshest rhetoric for one group of people more than the other. And so, biblically, we can say, look, the third way approach, you can find some correlative examples in the New Testament and Old Testament. And the other thing is it can alleviate some tensions. And this is where I talk about kind of the issue of modernism, right? Is modernism puts us all in a bind, a black and white bind, where it's either or. In fact, a lot of our political gridlock today and animosity today, I would say, is a holdover from the age of the Enlightenment and the modern age. And so seeking to relieve tension between that, I think, is a good desire. But I think this approach is not sufficient. So why? What's bad about the third way approach to missiology and cultural engagement? Well, let's look at the first one. First, it's a method and principle of engagement that can't be consistently applied. So it's a principle that's just not going to work out. If we use a reductio ad absurdum argument, this third way approach, if you try to employ it as like your way of seeing the world, it's not going to work for you. It's just not. And I want to give you three examples. The first is looking back on the Civil War. If you look at the North and the South in the Civil War, the third way approach would say neither was right. Neither was right. They're both bad. So we need to find a third way. If you look at World War II, you've got the Allied versus the Axis troops, right? You've got two opposing sides. And the third way approach would be neither side is right. We should do nothing. We should find a third way out of this war. And it's inherently pacifistic. It's trying to find a pacifistic way forward where there's inevitable conflict between worldviews or between nations. Another good example, and this is one I actually tweeted. This was really fun. It was about communists in Soviet Russia versus their dissidents. And so I tweeted out that neither the communist or the dissidents were right. They're both wrong. And I tagged the AND campaign because this is the kind of logic they use. And it was kind of what they call on Twitter a subtweet, where I was kind of teasing them, making fun of the way their logic gets employed and how it really is futile in many cases. And instead of either ignoring me, which most people do, or rebutting me and showing why I'm wrong about suggesting that's the kind of logic they employ, they actually liked the tweet. They actually endorsed the tweet and said, yeah, this is exactly what we believe, that both the communists and the dissidents were wrong. I mean, you're talking about a genocide in Soviet Russia. And these guys are saying, yeah, we should have picked sides. The dissidents were wrong to resist it. I mean, that kind of logic is insane. It's morally and biblically stupid. It's not smart. And this kind of logic employed wide scale is not helpful. The second point I want to make, and this kind of picks up on this first point, is that it turns history into bad guys versus bad guys. And so it misreads history wildly. It looks back on anyone who picks a side in any conflict and says, yeah, we're all better than them. We're all better than them. They should have chosen a third way. There's always a third way. And it leads Christians to believe that we are all better than anyone who came before us. And that leads me to my third point, is it comes across as extremely arrogant. It's arrogant. And when you employ it widely, that's just what it comes down to. It reminds me, and if you're a Christian, you know this. You've heard the illustration where you've got the ways that we all perceive religion. And so you've got the elephant. And in each religion is like a man touching a different part of the elephant that's blind. You've got a bunch of blind men touching parts of the elephant. So one man describes the ear in a certain way. It's thin and dry. One man touches the body, the trunk, or the body of the elephant. It's like, wow, this is a giant animal. Another touches the leg and describes it a certain way. And so each religion, the idea with that illustration is each religion has some aspect of the truth. And that's a neat way to try to diminish the absolute truth claims of any religion. But ultimately, it's an arrogant position, because what it says is that I'm the one who sees the elephant. and all these religions can't see it, but I know that it's an elephant, and they're all trying to describe what I already know, and I don't even submit myself to any of their truth claims. And I think this third way approach does the exact same thing. It says, I know what the best way is. All these other people, they're all wrong, and I'm better than all of them and smarter than all of them, and I stand apart from all of them, and I can judge them and show them that everyone in history has been wrong. I'm the only one that's right, and I'm going to show them what's right. And so I think it just comes down to a matter of pride and arrogance when we look back at history. I think it also traffics in false dilemmas and false dichotomies. So there are real dichotomies in the world. Not every dichotomy is false. But what this typically does is it tries to force any kind of opposing views into a false dichotomy, and it creates false equivalences, which goes back to a flattening of sin, that they're both bad. Saying both are bad is not insightful. It's just the common biblical perspective on the world. Yes, we're all sinners in need of God's grace. Yes, all parties, all perspectives, they're all going to be insufficient at the end of the day. Saying that they're both bad and therefore we should choose neither, that's not helpful moral reasoning. That's just like elementary Bible education on total depravity. The question isn't, are both bad? The question is, which choice is worse morally than the other? And so what it does, that's kind of another point, is it seeks to kind of bend perspectives to this flattening. So it perceives, for example, it perceives conservatives as greedy and socialists as generous. Well, that's not a really accurate representation of either position, but it's a very flattering way to represent them to the world, because it's like, look, neither are right, and we're trying to be, relevant and connect with you, especially if you are in a more liberal context. We're trying to say, look, conservatives are greedy, and we know you want to be generous. And that's typically how the third way approach is employed. It's typically slanted against a more conservative perspective. People who are conservative fiscally, yeah, there's lots of greedy people. Everyone struggles with greed. The question isn't, are conservatives greedy or socialists greedy? They're both greedy. The question is, which one leads to better conditions for humanity fiscally? And so that's what it comes down to. But with the third way approach, it doesn't allow for that kind of nuance. It just creates two opposing sides and then says they're both bad, we got to choose a different way. And so it seeks to synthesize. And this is the typical Hegelian approach to problems in our world. It seeks to take two opposing points of view and synthesize them into a new point of view. And so I don't think it's a biblical approach to moral reasoning. Another point is that I don't think it's actually that helpful and instructive to cultural engagement. Saying Christianity is neither right or left is about as insightful as saying Christianity is not hot or cold, or Christianity isn't red or green, or Christianity isn't purple or orange. It's just, okay, so what are we going to do about that? We can't just flatten everything into these false binaries and then try to find an escape out of it. Ultimately, I think one of the problems for me is it's an approach to our world and to Christianity that is very pietistic, and it really enables this kind of Anabaptist approach and almost antinomian approach, where what matters most about my spirituality is me preserving a sense of holiness about myself, and what matters most about my spirituality is my personal experience with Jesus. Now, those things, of course, matter, but in terms of the grand scheme of things, I believe third wayism is an approach that seeks to preserve people's piety so they don't have to pick a side, so they don't have to make moral choices. Instead, what's beautiful about that is you get to be like a desert father, and everyone loves the early church because, apparently there weren't a lot of controversies, which is just insane. There were tons of controversies. But it's almost like the desert fathers who were like, you know what, I'm going to go out to the desert. I'm going to be a monk in the desert and not engage with the world. It was a very Gnostic approach. And that's what I view this approach as. This third way approach is very Gnostic. It's like, I have special knowledge that you don't have, and I'm not going to get involved with the cares of the world. And so it leaves a lot of Christians going like, what are we doing here then? Like, what's our choice? What are we to do? And ultimately, I think it's a cowardly approach to cultural engagement. And then kind of my last critique, and this is where I'll kind of get into Keller's kind of foundational approach, his epistemic approach on it, is it creates a middle based on ever-evolving positions. So the typical one is left versus right, and what it does is it traffics in false dilemmas and these false dichotomies, and it creates these positions that are apparently morally the same. And so it goes left and right are both bad, And so what we want to do is find a different way. And what it does is it situates itself in the middle. Now, this is where Keller actually gets involved, and he's helpful, and he reveals something about himself. He reveals kind of his perspective on this approach, because he's been critiqued about this. Like, you can't just pick a third way based on these ever evolving. Left is always evolving into new iterations, especially in a progressive perspective where it's always kind of pushing a certain agenda. And then right has its own evolving that it's evolving into, and all this kind of thing. And so these positions are moving constantly, and to seek to just find a medium in the middle that's just a synthesis of both, that's not a really helpful way to morally engage these positions that are always changing. And so that's a big problem. And Keller picked up on this because he got a lot of flack for it. And so what he says is he's picking up on kind of the work from Thinking Through Creation, which I should pick up just so that I can have more substantial critiques. But this guy named Christopher Watkin, who is a professor in Australia, and he talks about and teaches on postmodernism and ways we can engage it. And so I'm understanding what he's saying here, and he's saying that it's not so much about finding a middle way, but it's seeking to diagonalize, is the fancy word that he uses. It's not to find a midway, but to diagonalize of a point off a spectrum. So it addresses both the concerns of those on the spectrum, but shows how it's above and better than both of those, trying to find a way. And so he says, look, you've got biblical justice, for example, and he's been writing about this a lot over the last year. Biblical justice critiques both the individualism of the right and the collectivism of the left. Okay, let's just stop there. That's fine. Like that's fine, but it doesn't give people a helpful way forward to see which is more dangerous to society and to the church. The same thing with, he talks about the relativism of liberals and the rigid moralism and of conservatives. Okay, well, both are actually very morally rigid. You can't just put one as more morally rigid than the other. They're both morally rigid in their own ways. And so he says it's not offering a middle way, but something altogether different. Now, Keller is very smart. And so I believe him in his approach, in that he's like trying to find a different way off kind of this binary grid that critiques both, but also speaks to both issues. What's not happening, though, is there's no limiting principle, and there's no sense that the people that are taking Keller's approach are employing it in that way. Instead, they're employing it with this kind of and campaign, compassion and conviction approach, of course, suggesting that the conservatives or Republicans are just not compassionate. They just don't care, which is an interesting perspective to have. I personally think it's wrong, of course, but the downstream effect of Keller's approach to this is not producing well-reasoned thinkers. It's producing thinkers who are just trying to escape confrontation with the world. And so this is why, this is kind of where we'll close out, is what's kind of getting under my skin about it is I'm seeing this employed all over the place. And it comes across as very simplistic, very simplistic. And instead, we should be teaching Christians to think more robustly, more biblically, more thoroughly about moral issues. I know this strategy, this postmodern attempt to synthesize the modern black and white, and it's not a workable solution. It's a critique that should be heard, but it's not a critique that should be employed. It should wake us up from some rigidity we have in our theology, but it's not something that we can take and then employ in Christianity in a way that's going to be constructive for people as disciples of Christ. There are tensions that we just have to live with as Christians, and we can't resolve them with rhetorical parlor tricks. It's leading a whole generation of Christians to believe that abortion is morally equivalent to bad words. Like that's moral insanity. And so if our world is already morally confused, it's not a really helpful thing to teach that the Bible views murder of one's child as the same as saying a bad word. Of course, in the eyes of God, any sin in the lordship of God over the universe, any sin is worthy of condemnation. Any sin will separate you from God. And we're all sinners, and we're all separated from God because we sin. But that doesn't mean that every sin is equally severe in God's scheme. Just read Romans 1. This is basic biblical reasoning on morality. But unfortunately, many Christians are taking this and employing it and believing that sin is just flat, and we can look at certain sins that are really morally repugnant in the Bible, and it's like, we're not any better. Like, just because I cussed this morning, I'm the same. And it's like, yeah, you're the same. You're a sinner, but like, one's worse. Like, one's definitely worse. I'm afraid that what it's doing is it's giving Christians an out in representing the faith so they don't experience hostility. It teaches Christians how to do this with every issue. Like, we don't actually have to say what the Bible says or read the Bible on it. We can just like avoid that hard topic. So that you get stuff like J.D. Greer will say something like, homosexuality doesn't send you to hell because heterosexuality doesn't save you. Why? Like, why are we saying this kind of these throwaway nonsense kind of third way approaches to Christianity? That's morally, it diminishes the authority of God's word. It misrepresents the moral landscape of God's word, the topographic landscape of God's word, to show that, like, look, of course, no Christian is saying heterosexuality saves you. That's not what Christians believe. But instead, he's trying to find a third way approach where it's like, look, see, we're trying to be nuanced and winsome to the culture by finding this third way, and being straight doesn't save you. And it's like, yeah, no one believes that. That's not the argument that's being made. And the same thing is being made with abortion. Abortion is a genocide against children in the womb. And what's being suggested is, look, we have to care about the baby in the womb and out of the womb. We're whole life, not just pro-life. And that's a neat, it's a neat rhetorical way to try to use language to be compelling to people. But the idea that, trying to prevent someone from being murdered is the same as certain economic positions, and whether it's welfare or whatever it is, that's morally repugnant. That's not biblical, and that's not a helpful approach for Christians. I don't know how people are getting away with this third way approach so rampantly, other than that they're in positions of power that they got, and now they just like tell everyone this is how we should reason with the Bible, and they don't want to be seen as fundamentalist. This is just a not smart way to approach theology. It's not helpful, and it's really revealing the bankruptcy a lot of these guys approach to cultural engagement and theology. And so this episode has been a little bit more heated than I typically want to be. I typically want to be a little bit more academic and reserved, but really, I've got friends who employ this, and my friends know this is a hobby horse for me. We'll tease each other over text about it, and so they tease me because of how heated I get on it. And so know that if you're hearing this and you're like, wow, Chase probably hates me, I don't hate you. I am attacking the ideas behind this. And so this is just kind of the way I view it. This is my best case for why I think there should at least be a moratorium on the third way approach, and we should really be particular about how we employ it, because not every moral issue is equally equivalent. So thanks so much for diving in. I hope this content was helpful. If you found it helpful or you found it interesting, I'd love it if you shared this with somebody. Go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Give us a like there. Share this podcast. Leave a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening or watching. And thank you so much for checking us out. If you haven't picked up my book, I mentioned it in this episode. You can find my book, Trinitarian Formation, on Amazon. You can find it at Walmart. You can find it at Barnes & Noble. There's lots of places you can find my book, but I'd really encourage you to pick it up. It touches on these issues. That's part of the reason I'm so passionate about this topic, is it touches on issues of knowledge formation and cultural engagement. And so Trinitarian Formation, you can find it pretty much wherever books are sold, but you should pick up a copy today and read over it. Read it with a friend, and let me know what you think. Leave a review on Amazon. I'd love that. Until then, we will see you next time.